mine. I'll just do it on my personal one. It says it's preparing to live stream. Okay. Still a delay?
Nope, no delay.
Okay. You there? Okay.
Yeah.
Ingrid, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, this is like, I really get down for these Nerd Out Mondays because we have some really good conversations, and you're one of, at least in recent months, been one of the most, one of the people I've enjoyed most nerding out with. So, Ingrid, tell the audience a little bit about who you are and where you are and what you do.
Yeah, I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee. I am a professor, and I'm also director of the Cooperative of Communities for PACES Connection, formerly ACES Connection. We just changed our name. And I'm also a consultant with Cockhren Consulting. I consult with institutions and nonprofits that are serving children and families or have a training need that's DEI focused.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're doing really incredible work. And it's been so fun to see especially your private consultancy really taking off in the last year or so. And because what you bring to it is so vital to the movement, your perspective and your work in diversity, inclusion, and equity. So what I'd love to hear a little bit about to start is just sort of your personal, I asked this a little bit of Mona, and I tried to get it out of Steve, but because you're going to be a keynoter for our conference in spring, June 1st through the 4th. And I'd love for our audience to hear a little bit about your own personal journey into this trauma-informed world and, how it got started for you and what that's been for you.
Yeah, it's been a long time now. So I started working for the state of Tennessee in their Department of Children's Services, and I work really with incarcerated youth. So children between 12 and 18 that had committed either 3 felonies, rape or murder. And at that time, I was really just kind of wandering through life. It was just a job. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with myself. And so my interactions with those children really led me into the field of psychology. So I decided to pursue education because first, I just thought it was very interesting. Interesting is such a morbid word for this, but how do children get to the point where they're 12 and already have committed 3 felonies, rape or murder? And that was interesting to me, and I wanted to know more about their backgrounds. Also, in my interactions with them, it was not what I expected. For the most part, they were just like your typical children that you would interact with. They were funny, they were sweet. And with the exception of very few, they were typical children. And one thing that stood out to me is they were overwhelmingly Black children. And it was both boys and girls. So the majority of the children there, probably about 80% of them were Black, even though the state of Tennessee is not, doesn't have a large African-American population. So it's extremely disproportionate. And so I started to pursue a degree, a bachelor's degree in psychology, really focused on intergenerational incarceration. And at that time, I was really, I like to say, I called myself I had an inner white supremacist. So I was really focusing on parents as the issue. So, this must be a parenting problem. And so it must be something about Black parenting that is creating this situation where we have a disproportionate amount of Black children going into the criminal justice system. And so I continued my work into grad school at Vanderbilt's Peabody College. And that's when I took on the focus of Black parenting specifically. And my work was African-American parenting practices, parenting styles. And that's when I found out about the ACEs study. So this was probably about 2010. And
wow, you were like one of the first, because I think the vast majority of us hadn't even heard of that at that time.
Well, Peabody has, it's a huge resource, it's a research college. And so That's all we did. It was very rigorous. So I found the study there. And I also began to have like the beginning of my understanding of historical trauma. So how trauma passed along through generations. And so this really helped me to be able to understand what was impacting Black parents and change the narrative for me when it came to Black children being incarcerated. But beyond trauma, it also began my journey into kind of systems work. And so how systems, racist systems within a racist country were really driving the inequities that we see in criminal justice, education, medicine. And that helped me to have a better framework of understanding historical trauma and how it plays out in children's development and, basically within our society as a whole.
Sorry, I keep muting myself because my family, my dog, everything. It's that time of the evening, right? And I'm like, oh my God, be quiet, please.
Yeah, I have a 2-year-old and a big dog. Well, she's 3 now. So, and a big dog, so I understand.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess one of the things I'm curious about, because I feel like I resonate so much with your story of it was the work you were doing that really intrigued you about why the disproportionality, right? Why so many more brown and Black children in the criminal justice system than white children. And I guess one of the things I wonder about is what in the research did you discover during your graduate studies that kind of maybe disrupted or was different than you thought it would be? Like, what did you, not so much what did you think you would find, but what did you find that really was like, oh, okay, this is starting to make sense. This is starting to connect the dots for me.
It was overwhelmingly, ACEs science, the understanding that trauma is both a psychological and a physical experience. And so my better understanding of the nervous system and the brain, and also how just, as a species, trauma is really about, the evolution of human beings. And so as we are pushed forward in our evolution or even backwards based on environment. And so if my environment is hostile, then that's going to have an impact on my physical body, my hormones, the way that my brain processes information. It's going to have an impact on my metabolism, my immune system. It's definitely going to impact cognitive ability, IQ. And so it was just very interesting to see it within that context, that it's not just behavior, it's not just mental health, but it's also physical health. So the ACEs study was pivotal, the study itself, that first one, that really just made a clear connection between traumatic experiences and physical and mental health outcomes that I was not able to see before.
Yeah. And so when did your journey deepen into like then contextualizing that and seeing it through the lens of, historical experiences? Do you remember when that kind of happened and what that was for you?
Yeah, that was right around, it was probably about 2013, 2014. So after I got my degree, my focus was family counseling. And so I was just really immersed in family work. I was doing in-home intensive family counseling. So children who had been referred through either CPS, and they were court ordered to go through some type of family counseling. And I was essentially like it was like super nanny, where you go in and you really, you're really hands-on and really help families, specifically around behavior work. That's really most of it, where a child is violent or suicidal, and the family is just really struggling, and authorities have been involved and they've been mandated to have some type of safety training and also behavioral work and family counseling. And so that really helped me to understand kind of like, it pulled back the veil for me that, a lot of families are dealing with extremely high stress and trauma in their homes with children who have behavioral and mental health issues. And they were at a loss. They had no idea how to control their children's behavior. And the work that I did there really helped me to understand the dynamics, that we're talking about families who are dealing with a shattered sense of safety all the time, and
Mm,
that they have, stress hormones in their system all the time. They're always dysregulated.
mm,
And so that was interesting to me. And then I began to notice a pattern of the families that I work with and the children where they had these mental health issues, along with, there was generational, along with physical health issues. So the parents who had this high stress, they were also more likely to have issues around high blood pressure and chronic disease and disability.
mhm,
And so I was beginning just to really make connections back to that study, the ACE study that I had that I come across in grad school. And then I was seeing it in real life, where,
mhm,
high rates of disability, mental health issues, chronic disease that were then passed along through generations within families. And
mhm,
so, and the families that I work with were pretty diverse. They were disproportionately African American. But here in Nashville, we have a diverse population. So I was working with Kurdish families. I was working mostly with white families. I had both low income and high income families.
mhm,
And so I was able to see that this was an issue within all of those groups, and that it was an issue that was very clearly connected through generations. And so
mhm,
I wanted to explore more about uh, how this process happened. What does it look like in real time for issues to be passed along through families? And then I created my initial presentation about this to the state of Tennessee through connecting the conference Connecting Children's Justice. And I think it was like 2015 or 2016. I did my first presentation for the state along the lines of intergenerational and historical trauma.
mm,
And I've been doing it ever since, where I basically made the connection between different factors, maladaptive coping and um, and eugenics and
mhm,
epigenetics, and then also social learning, and just this way that we see race as a genetic issue, when it's not, it's more of an environmental issue, and how
mhm,
that has morphed over time. And all of it is extremely controversial because we have, when we look at eugenics, it's saying basically that there's superior genes that
mhm,
have been connected to whiteness. And then as I did more digging, then we have epigenetics come in that
mhm,
really is highlighting that it's about environment. And
mhm,
so as we have groups that experience more hostile environments due to racism, poverty, um, that then they have this wear and tear or allostatic load that comes
mhm.
along with that. And it helped me to really see this in a totally different way.
Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, the social learning, which is that we model based on the adults in our environment as
Mhm,
children. And so being able to put it all together
mm,
um, was it really changed my life, but also it changed the direction of all of the work that I've done since.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I hear that when I listen to you speak, just the sort of evolution in your perspective and your understanding of, and I think to me, part of what makes me excited about it is that I'm somebody like I'm doing right now. I'm somebody that's always been interested in understanding what's underneath. Like, so whatever problems we're experiencing, what underlies that and um, what's sort of causing this pattern to repeat from parent to child or from generation to generation. And I can definitely see that that's a perspective that you hold that I think in some ways is becoming more common, but for a long time has been uncommon.
Yeah.
So we think about problems as just what's happening right now and in this moment, and we don't tend to want to like lift the veil and understand, well, what's underneath that. But when you do this work and you become connected to people and you care about kids and you care about families and you care about what's happening in your community, it like requires you to get curious and to
Yeah.
dig deeper. And so I'm kind of, one of the things that I think is really interesting And we can talk, I don't know, there's a little, not side conversation, but another line of thinking that we can go down in a bit. But I'm curious to hear, or have our audience hear, a little bit about the connection that you made or have made, and you're not the only one, but you speak of it often, between harsh parenting practices within the African American community and sort of survival adaptation that ends up emerging in Black children. And it's something that when I've heard you speak of it, it brings me back to my experiences in the Black community. And like, I remember being young and working with children in an inner city setting and not being able to really kind of, what's the word I want to use? Like, understand, like, I could see that the parents had very high expectations about that stuff and were very rigid and very harsh. And so in my way of thinking and in my own personal experiences, I thought that that would translate into very, like, well-behaved kids, and it didn't, and so I'd love for our audience to hear a bit about what your discovery has been with historically harsh parenting and what that's resulted in, where that
Yeah.
comes from.
Yeah. So when we talk about African Americans, at least, our American experience, it has started with slavery, and all of our cultural influences that's the kind of our origin. And so, spanking and harsh punishment is not specific to Black people. It is more of a Southern issue. It's more of a religious issue. And it just so happens that African Americans in our American experience are mostly Southern, at least in our roots. We migrated out of the South after during the Great Migration, after slavery and Reconstruction. And we are also the most religious group in America, with high rates of attending services more than once a week and going to church every Sunday and having a community around the Black church. And so it is kind of that intersection. And then, of course, during slavery, there is a bit of displacement. So as oppressors, overseers are actively being violent against slaves, then slaves have internalized that, especially slave mothers, to ensure their survival. In that, if as a mother during slavery, I have to keep strict control over my child, because when their behavior is not in control, then it's a life or death situation. And so what does that look like to parent a child during slavery when they could flirt with the wrong kid or look at the wrong person in the eye or just engage in very regular, typical childhood behaviors? This would require me to have a very strict survival-based parenting style, where I will engage in violence to make sure that my child is safe. And even though it does not translate to today, but in slavery it was an extremely effective tactic, because then you could make sure that your child, whether or not they were in your supervision or not, would be less likely to engage in something that would get them killed or get yourself killed. And then also there was a tactic during slavery where if one slave was out of line, then it wasn't just that that particular slave would be reprimanded, but it would be in a way that it would send a message to all slaves. And so this is, psychological warfare. And so Black mothers had to adapt and ensure that their children would survive, with parenting practices that were extreme, but then also lacking in attachment because of family separation. So it's very common for families to be separated. Children would be sold off as early as 5 or 6, or parents would be sold off while their children were as young as 5 or 6. And so there would have to be this understanding that a child would have to be able to live without their mother. And so it's kind of a preparation for oppression. that is embedded within Black parenting that still exists today. And obviously it's less extreme, but it still exists today, and it is hindering our ability to be competitive with children who are not raised in this way. Let's see, Emily, you're muted.
When I heard you start to describe that, when we were in a conversation, the two of us, I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. Just that historical context being really hard to shed through generations, especially where we still see that the consequence of quote unquote inappropriate behavior or misbehavior in the Black community is going to have potentially much graver consequence than children who are not children of color. And so one of the things that it made me reflect on is, did you have a chance to see that video that I shared with you last week?
I don't think so.
Okay.
What was I've seen so many,
So
to be
yeah,
honest.
so there was
the context of the video.
Yeah. So there was a video that was shared with me by a fellow colleague who works down in Maryland, and it was a video of a young Black boy. He was 5, and so I guess we're kind of like fast forwarding to how might this play out today in our schools, and what might this look like? Because I think in many ways, what we're struggling with right now in our schools is this long-standing attachment to this idea that harshness, strictness, rigidity are things that raise children well. That if kids know that there's severe consequences awaiting them, that they'll get in line and do what they're supposed to do. And of course, I mean, we understand that, yes, fear is a motivator of kinds, or is a not a motivator, that's a bad way to say it. Fear is an effective deterrent for certain kinds of behaviors. However, it's not without grave consequence. So going back to this situation with that child that I'm describing, this little boy it was heartbreaking. He was arrested. He was dealt with by the police in a very harsh manner. And one of the things that happened that was just awful to watch was that you had actually it was a female officer. She was African American there with the school personnel, and she was screaming at the little boy and sort of like acting as a stand-in parent, if you will, in that moment in a very harsh way, and telling the little boy that he was a bad boy. And then, long story short, the mother finally arrives to the scene, and she is saying that she wants to beat him, but she can't because she'll get arrested. And the officer is telling her, no, you can beat your child and you can get your child in line. And the reason why this made news and why it was so appalling, other than all the reasons I'm just describing, is that there's still this very common misperception or misunderstanding or myth that we can get kids to behave if we just punish them more severely. And so I guess I'm wondering, sort of like, as you go around and you consult and you talk with people, do you find that people really resist what it is that you have to share, and that it's still a prevailing mindset or prevailing mentality, either within the Black community or just within our schools in general?
It's pervasive still within the Black community. I get a lot of pushback when I present. I've gone into the Black church and told them they need to stop spanking. It's really never received well in the Black community, but I will say that, depending on my audience, I definitely have, I've received a lot of traction around the idea that when we look at Black parenting and we think about whether or not, this is a good tactic or if it's effective or not, it's not so much that it's not effective. but like you said, there's consequences. And so that the understanding of the consequences is what's important, that parents understand that there is a consequence, that there's something that's lost when you use harsh punishment. And then on the other end of things, like in schools, where it's harsh punishment, but it's rarely physical, then it's just this understanding that you don't have to be so heavy-handed with Black children. There's just this narrative that everyone has gotten on board with, that Black children have to have harsh punishment to change their behavior, which then becomes a cycle, because this harsh environment, again, going back to the initial ACEs study, is really what's driving what we consider to be poor behavior. And so as we increase harsh punishment, it's not going to be effective in the child being able to make good decisions and regulate themselves, their minds, and their bodies. And this is true for parenting at home, and it's true for discipline in schools. And it's really sad, because it is a part of this overall narrative that Black people are inferior, that they're less intelligent, that you can't just talk to them, you have to get physical with them. And this is something that's been passed down from the larger society, which then is embedded in parenting, and is used as a tool to control. And one group is doing it out of love and survival, and the other group is doing it out of this understanding of hierarchy, and who's on top and who is superior in the situation.
Exactly. And so, I mean, part of what I think is it's heartbreaking is just that even within the Black community, that people are so, what I think is hard to break through is the level of defense mobilization around the necessity of this in order to survive. It's like, you know, you need a certain degree of safety in order to break and interrupt that cycle. And it's not just safety for the children, it's also safety for the parents. It's also them having a restored faith in, like, for example, the schools. And I think one of the things that upset me the most in watching that whole video was, first of all, it was not, I'll just be honest and say, it was not an uncommon circumstance. And I'll even acknowledge that I feel like I've been in that situation. And furthermore, I may have been a quiet, silent bystander. There was a number of educators that were in there that were not protecting that child. And I don't know what that was about in that moment, because I wasn't there. But I kind of wonder about what, I mean, and we're going to talk about this more in the conference, but are there things that you feel like are priorities in terms of things that we need to do in our schools to start working back towards establishing a sense of trust for families? Because I feel like if that feeling that school is there as either pipeline to prison, or is there to in some way exclude or marginalize a whole community's children, then it's going to be very hard for them to walk back from that kind of parenting, right? Because they're just going to feel like that's what they have to do to try to help their kids survive the system. So what do you feel like is one of those things that is a priority for schools right now, especially in the context of pandemic, when we have overwhelmingly more children of color that have been totally absent from our schools than children that are white? Like, what do you feel like what schools need to be focusing on? I know that's a big question.
It is a big question, and it brings up a lot. Often when I talk about schools, which I am definitely a critic of America's public school system, schools are just they're just a reflection of a larger society. We have schools that do not serve certain groups because our society doesn't serve certain groups, and that's the end of the story. So if there's really no way And I am a pessimist, I will admit. And I've had this conversation just yesterday with another educator. Um, there is really
We'll
not
answer
a
the question. We'll answer the question from, like, let's just step into the world of being an idealist for a moment, Ingrid.
okay.
What would you want? What would you want to see our schools doing?
Mm,
Entering, you know, having students, I don't know exactly what Tennessee has been. I know where I am in New Hampshire, schools are finally resuming full in-person learning. And that's got a whole host of challenges. But when students start to resume full in-person learning, what would you ideally like to see them doing to communicate to their children, their most vulnerable and or marginalized kids and families? What would you prefer to see them, not prefer, what would you like to see them doing
yeah, if
to
we were
help?
in an ideal society, then schools,
Yes.
American public schools would be the vehicle for this understanding of white history. And
Mm.
so this is
Amen,
a
sister.
this is a it is a it's an institution that's built on learning, that is structural, and it can be used as a tool to have a clear understanding of the structures of white supremacy in this country.
Mhm.
It can tell the truth about the entire process of this American experience. It can tell the truth about slavery. It can tell the truth about the violence that has occurred in domestic terrorism that has been directed towards Black people and including Black children. It can tell the truth about the prison industrial complex. That would be the only thing that I think that the schools are equipped and able to do.
Mhm.
And so, that curriculum is going to be important. Telling the
Yes.
truth about again white history, and 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 not just for schools where there are the majority of the children are Black, but
Mhm.
white children also need to have a clear understanding of white history as well.
Mhm.
Um, and that's the thing that that's the only thing that schools are capable of doing. I'm not so much behind SEL learning or other interventions in schools. I don't think schools should be in the business of mental health. I
Mhm.
think schools should be reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so I think that those other issues that are problematic within schools are societal problems.
Mm.
And so I don't think that schools should take that energy and money and resources to
Mhm.
address that, mainly because it's not exactly effective. I mean, just
Mhm.
a pragmatist, it's just not working.
Mhm.
Um, and really use the structure that they have to engage in some radical inquiry and
Mhm.
tell the truth about systems and do some truth and reconciliation. And that's the thing that I think that that's the only thing they're equipped really to do. They have the infrastructure to impart a curriculum that is focused on the truth.
Mhm. Mhm. So you and I will come back and not in this conversation, but you and I will come back and revisit the whole mental health conversation in schools. But I hear exactly what you're saying, which is that you feel like curriculum and pedagogically, there are things that could be altered in order to reveal more of the truth of what the system of education has been and has meant for children of color. So, and in particular, Black children, because I think those experiences obviously are not universal. Like children of color, um, are more likely to have poor outcomes in our educational systems, but Black children in particular um, are really the ones who have it the worst, frankly. And so one of the things I'm wondering about too is just you and I have chatted a bit about this, and we could finish on this note, but we've gotten into, I've talked a bit about having worked in many different various settings. And one of the things that I noted was that I worked with rural, poor white kids. And a lot of the patterns that I saw of struggle are mirrored in poor white children um, that I saw in Black communities and communities of color. And so, do you want to reflect a little bit for our audience about how white supremacy also can be very damaging for poor white kids?
Yeah, and so this is very prevalent. When we think about poverty, the majority of families living in poverty are white just because of, just sheer numbers. It's
Mhm,
disproportionate when it comes to Black and Indigenous and Hispanic families, but just sheer numbers. There's, a lot of of white families living in poverty, and all the things that come along with it. And so when we look at poverty specifically, and even the survival parenting practices come along with poverty.
mhm,
America has really cut off its nose to spite its face when it comes to racism, as they attempt to ensure that other groups, Black people, Indigenous people, are not allowed to thrive. They also enact policies and practices that impact poor white families.
mhm,
Um, so the purpose of it is to ensure that Black and Indigenous are not having access to equal resources. And the unintended, or maybe even intended, um, casualty is also poor white people.
mhm,
Um, and this is something that I rarely talk about just because I'm definitely an advocate for people of color,
mhm,
but it's just so prevalent and so obvious that but white supremacy prevents people who have the same issues from
mhm,
being able to address them in a real way. And so
mhm,
our issues around healthcare, education, just access, even housing,
mhm,
rural areas are they have plenty of disparities and inequity in rural areas.
mhm,
However, we have attached race to morality. And
mhm,
so poor white families, or the poor white ideology in general, is to say that people of color who are suffering because they make bad choices, or
mhm,
because they have a culture of criminality, or they don't have good values and good morals.
mhm.
Um, but at the end of the day, both entities are suffering from poverty and the other systemic issues that go along with white supremacy.
Mhm.
But one group is gets to say that they're white, and that's is an advantage, even though they literally have no other advantage.
Exactly.
And so it's a very interesting dynamic. And it at the core of it, the core of America's issues around this, again, America has cut off its nose to spite its face when it comes to racism, is the inability to have equal access because you don't want Black and Indigenous to prosper, has
Mhm,
also led to just a total decline in our education,
mhm,
has led to a regression in our world standing,
mhm,
a lack of belief in science and trust in government.
mhm,
And this is impacting our country as a whole. Um,
mhm.
and at the root of it is the attempt to only
Keep the power
ensure,
and the resources in the hands
yeah,
of a few. Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah,
And that's
100%.
always been the case.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Ingrid, I love nerding out with you. You're one of my most favorite nerd out friends. And I can't wait to do it again in June.
Yes.
So join Ingrid Cockhren on June 3rd at our conference, and you can find out more information about that on our website. And in the meantime, Ingrid, take good care, and I'll talk to you again soon. Good
Yes.
night.
Amy, thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
Take good care. You too. Bye-bye.